This is Taya Grimm and Stephen Janis reporting for the Real News Network here in Baltimore City, Maryland. We're outside the Mitchell Courthouse where we're hearing the prosecutors' closing arguments in the trial of Lieutenant Brian Rice, one of the 6 officers charged with the in-custody death of Freddie Gray. Later, we'll be speaking to legal experts. So, Stephen, you were in the courtroom with me today.
Right.
What did you think of the prosecutors' closing arguments? What did you think was her strongest point?
Well, she talked about the narrative that has thus far been presented, not just in the courtroom, but the media. And she made some very interesting arguments, because one of the main arguments that the defense has made about the reason that Freddie Gray wasn't seatbelted and that they didn't do anything to provide for his safety was that he was combative.
Yes.
So she sort of went through video and pictures and showed that their main reason they said Freddie Gray was combative was because there was a huge crowd, and that Freddie Gray was being, I guess, flailing his arms, and again, the idea of his legs. And during the trial, during this particular argument, she kind of went through an entire sequence showing that there wasn't much of a crowd, maybe 7 to 10 people in the first stop. And then by the second stop, it was 3 to 4 people. And then she, again, referenced a video about Freddie Gray's lack of a combativeness as seen on the video.
Right.
So, and then she also shows something very interesting that really hasn't been emphasized much in all this case, in terms of all the narratives we have seen, which is Nero, Miller, and Rice bike away almost immediately once Freddie Gray is in the van. Go and meet on this corner far away from where the van is.
She described it kind of as an alley where the 3 of them met, correct?
Yeah, they had this meeting, which no one's really ever explained why they met, what they were talking about. I mean, they did call in, well, I'll get to that, but they have this meeting where they all meet. They go away from the van. This van that they describe is shaking, rocking violently, the crowds and everything that they describe, all the stuff that they say sort of figured into their analysis that they had to actually handcuff and actually hogtie Freddie later on. All that stuff, they're not observing that. They're not in front of the van. They are not watching the van move. They are not in front of the crowd. They're in this alley, all 3 of them. Now, these are the 3 people who initiated the arrest. These are the people, 2 of the men are the people who actually arrested and detained Freddie Gray, and Brian Rice is the person who ordered his arrest. And they all get together. And in that little meeting, they call the van and tell it to stop. And that's where they make this decision to hog time. Now, if it truly was like this continuum of behavior of the crowd, as it was Freddie Gray, why did they leave that scene and come and make a decision and then go to the van? And I think that was really interesting, because I think it shows a certain intentionality that is far removed from what the defense has argued was part of their spectrum of decision making.
Now, initially, the prosecutor described for Lieutenant Rice something that seemed almost like a decision tree, and she went through a series of choices that he made where she said he chose not to act. Could you describe a little bit of what the prosecutor was talking about?
Right, well, she goes through almost every step from, he chose not to seatbelt him. He chose not to call for aid. Right. He chose not to provide for or examine him when he had him in the van to see if he was injured. He chose not to do this and X, Y, Z. She went down a very extensive list of what he chose not to do. And I think the idea there is to say this was a decision. This was a calculated decision to not provide for safety, to not follow orders. Like, he chose not to follow Order K-14, which is the order, the general order that was put off, that was disseminated by the police just prior to Freddie Gray being in the back van, that required officers to belt people in the van. So he chose not to follow K-14. She was very methodical about going down the list. So it was effective, and I think it also showed that the big criticism of the defense that they've not been able to make a case that this was a concerted effort to ignore the law, and I think that was what the intention was, and I think it was effective.
It did seem that they showed that inaction can be as deadly and can be as significant as action itself. Now, Judge Barry Williams said something interesting. He said, "I'm a vessel. I'm taking it all in." He said this when the prosecutor was talking. What do you think of Judge Barry Williams' demeanor today?
Well, he was saying this in response to Jan Bledsoe saying, you're giving me that look again. The word of skepticism was brought up, because I think it sort of illuminated the frustration of the prosecution that they have not yet won a conviction, and two of the decisions have been made specifically by Judge Barry Williams. And I think it was an interesting, very, very interesting encounter, because it shows sort of that the prosecution feels like their arguments aren't being given fair sort of consideration.
Did you think the defense had any cogent arguments? Did they think they had some strong points?
Well, I think the primary linchpin of the defense argument, and I think this is the one that interestingly people believe, is that if you believe that Freddie Gray was a combative, if you believe that the crowd was egging Freddie Gray.
And hostile.
Hostile and egging Freddie Gray on, and that for Freddie Gray's own safety, he had to be hogtied and laying flat in the back of the van. Then that was their argument. Their argument was, these officers made reasonable decisions. He also took great issue with the defense, sort of Jan Bledsoe's, he chose not to litany.
Yes.
And there was an interesting and sort of combative moment when he said the defense has failed to prove that the General Order K-14 applies to Lieutenant Rice. And Judge Barry Williams said, what do you mean? Why wouldn't it apply to him? How have they failed to prove that? And he really didn't have an explanation for that. But you can see in that argument the entire spectrum of law enforcement in Baltimore. A general order issued by a commissioner to a lieutenant supervisor, they're making the argument in a court of law that it doesn't apply to him. That that it's the burden of the state to approve that a general order applies to a lieutenant.
Stephen, something that I found really interesting was Jan Bledsoe describing how Lieutenant Rice interacted with the crowd. Now, one of the defense's main points was that a crowd, or a hostile crowd in Gilmore Homes, that Gilmore Homes was literally emptying out, was one of the reasons why they had to move the van to stop too when they did.
Yeah.
And she said during his interaction with a young man who was using his cell phone to videotape them, I believe his name was Brandon Ross, and there was an interaction between them, a bit of an argument. And the prosecutor Bledsoe played the tape where you could hear Lieutenant Brian Rice interacting with Rose and with the crowd. And he says, jail, jail, jail. That sort of interaction to me doesn't seem like de-escalation. What did you think of Bledsoe's comments?
Well, first of all, she played an excerpt from the video. You can hear him say very demonstratively, jail, jail, jail. This was at the second stop where Freddie Gray was being taken out and putting into the handcuffs and the shackles.
Yeah.
So the judge refused to say, the judge basically said, hey, I'm not going to listen to that because it wasn't introduced into evidence. But I did think it pointed out that there was an aggressiveness to this arrest, and there was a sort of defensiveness about it.
Yes.
Right? It's something that wasn't really mentioned, but it's sort of the big elephant in the room, is it showed that the officers were defensive, which sort of intersects with the other evidence, how they drove and huddled together, or biked and huddled together away from the crowd, how they made the van stop again, how they made this van stop 6 times. I think it showed that Rice was angry and there was something other going on other than what that has been contended throughout this trial. And I think that's why that was a significant piece of evidence.
Do you think the prosecution has actually reached the burden of proof necessary to get a conviction?
No. It seemed very similar to the other trials. It seemed like Judge Williams was questioning the state's case in the same way that he did with the other trials in terms of what Officer Rice's specific role was and where he actually came into play as to what stop, and then in terms of being the proximate cause or the actual cause of Mr. Gray's injury. It just seemed like the court had trouble linking his role to the eventual death.
Now, Judge Barry Williams made a statement I found interesting, which he was talking to the prosecution, to Prosecutor Bledsoe, and said, I'm an open vessel. I'm just ready to basically take everything in. And I would say Prosecutor Bledsoe thought that was somewhat humorous. What did you think of Judge Barry Williams' demeanor today?
It's always difficult when humor gets injected into such a serious trial, but there has to be some levity. I mean, everyone's human, but I like that statement. It kind of let everybody know that he was still open to questioning the police and listening to the state's case and holding the police accountable if they could just give us some evidence. And he was looking for it.
Judge Barry Williams' final decision of the day was that the verdict will come Monday. This is Taya Graham and Stephen Janis reporting for the Real News Network here in Baltimore City, Maryland.